Is the monstrous Jeffrey Dahmer really the worst human being the planet has ever seen? Well, the prisoners you're about to see today will make your blood run cold. Lock your door and make yourself comfortable. These are the most dangerous prisoners in the world. To take the life of his 82-year-old landlady, Fabian Kramer, a visibly disturbed 19-year-old, chose to wear a gruesome serial killer mask inspired by the horror movie Saw. After his crime, Kramer called the police to tell them to come quickly because someone was bleeding. The height of vice. Alexander Yurovich Petrushkin committed his first crime at the age of 18, and since then he has reoffended 60 times, plus 3 people he attacked without killing. He was convicted only for 48 of his victims. The so-called chessboard killer was sentenced to life imprisonment, and what is most chilling is that he stated that if he had not been arrested, he would never have stopped, and that the police saved many lives by capturing him. At least one who has the merit of being honest. I thought that Putin was the one who had the least heart among the Russians. Dennis Rader, or BTK Strangler, the nickname he so affectionately gave himself for the horrible monster he was, is responsible for 10 crimes committed in Kansas. He started out as a young man torturing animals to channel his sadistic fantasies and perverse urges, but soon moved on to humans. Also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer was a dangerous pervert and a killer with a psychiatric disorder. This is evidenced by the atrocity of his murders. Dahmer took the lives of 17 men and boys and committed his crimes in truly horrific ways. He did it in such a horrific way that he shocked the United States. Google the Crime Corner podcast to hear all the details of this case, as we can't give them to you here. Anyway, 2 years after his arrest, Jeffrey was shot and killed by a fellow inmate in Wisconsin. Being sentenced to 128 years in prison, he really deserved it. Pedro Rodriguez Filho took the lives of 71 people. The Brazilian committed his first murder at the age of 14 and never stopped. His most demonic crime was to kill his own father, who was in prison for having slaughtered his mother, a vice that in the Filho family is passed on from generation to generation, from father to son. Luis Garavido, called La Bestia, no need to translate. This Colombian pleaded guilty to the horrific acts of 147 boys, the number having been loosely deduced from the remains of skeletons found in his home. In 1999, he was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison. I don't know if Michel Drucker will still be alive when he gets out. A poetic nickname for a terrifying portrait, that of Aileen Wuornos, or Miss of Death. This American killed 7 men in Florida after they desecrated her body without her consent while she was working as a prostitute. Aileen was sentenced to death by lethal injection in 2002 at the Florida State Prison in Starkey Bradford County. He knew how to play the guitar, but also knew very well how to take life. Charles Manson was a leader of a community called the Manson family during the hippie era. He became famous in Los Angeles for a series of murders in 1969. Among his murders, there is the one of the actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, and 4 of her friends. But he never got his hands dirty, as all his crimes were ordered. Leonard Lake was a serial killer well known to his generation for committing horrific acts on 11 to 25 people with the help of an accomplice, Charles N.G., in a remote cabin in Wilsonville, California. After his arrest, Lake killed himself by ingesting cyanide. Yes, you read the word angel right in the nickname, Angel of Death, attributed to serial killer Donald Harvey of Ohio. This nurse by profession claims to have hastened the end of 87 people, supposedly to relieve the pain of his victims, hence his other nickname, the Death Nurse. What an oxymoron. He received a life sentence but was himself murdered. It seems that life sometimes takes its revenge. Behind this charismatic and charming air, Ted Bundy embodied absolute vice. This American serial killer committed the worst atrocities on about 30 women according to official figures. Horror in all its forms. It was said that he was the incarnation of the devil. SeungHui Cho is the man responsible for the Virginia Tech University carnage in the United States. In this terrible shooting, the Korean killer took the lives of 33 people. He then killed himself to avoid being held accountable for his actions, while the police were at the same time determining his location. The Rostov Monster, the Rostov Ogre, the Butcher of the Forest, the Russian Ripper, or Citizen X. Choose the one that inspires you the most to name Andrei Romanovich, this killer who is considered the most maniacal and vicious criminal of the century. He killed more than 50 girls after raping, strangling, and stabbing them. Whitey Bulger, one of the 10 most wanted fugitives from the FBI in 1999. This American was arrested in his Santa Monica home in 2011 when he was 81 years old. The reasons? Robbery, murder, extortion, and drug trafficking. He finally died in 2018 under the violent blows of his fellow inmates. Looking at his little friendly grandpa face, you wouldn't believe that Thomas Silverstein is responsible for several murders, several of which were even committed while he was incarcerated. It must be done. He was put in solitary confinement after taking the life of a prison guard and has been in solitary confinement since 1983 in Illinois. He was the longest-serving prisoner in solitary confinement until his death in 2019. A nightmarish face which would scare away the biggest demons, James Barnum, nicknamed Eyeball because of his tattooed eye, was sentenced in 2015 to 22 years in prison for an attempted murder and a series of burglaries in Alaska. Prior to that conviction, James Barnum had 14 other grievances with the law. To put your mind at ease, he pleaded guilty and even apologized. For Robert Ben Rhodes, his truck was more of a torture chamber than a transportation vehicle. This American from Council Bluffs assaulted and took the lives of about 50 women, but was only convicted of 3 of them. He was arrested one day when a policeman came to see that his truck had broken down. How did the policeman realize that something was wrong? Well, he simply found a woman in chains. Richard Ramirez developed satanic and sadistic tendencies at an early age. Under the guidance of his cousin, he learned the techniques of killing and later committed 14 murders and 11 assaults on women in Los Angeles and San Francisco. He was sentenced to death but died of lymphoma at age 53. When you type John Wayne Gacy on Google, you will see the word clown. And yet, believe me, this man is not funny. He is one of the most famous American serial killers in the world. And if he is nicknamed the Killer Clown, it is because, as you may have guessed, he used to dress up as a clown to entertain children in hospitals. But at the same time, he committed crimes at the height of horror. His icy face is enough to make you throw up your 4 o'clock. James Edward Wood is not only a serial killer, he is also a serial rapist. He was charged and sentenced to death for the murder of Gerald Underwood, an 11-year-old newspaper carrier whom he lured into his car. Even more disgusting, he kept the lifeless body for more than a week to enjoy before disposing of it in a river. Brian Koji Uchisugi, the name behind of the biggest murders in history. On the morning of November 2nd, 1999, at a Xerox building in Honolulu, a worker named Brian Uchisugi showed up for work and immediately opened fire on his co-workers. Brian Uchisugi will take the lives of 7 people. The small island of Hawaii is still traumatized. Here is Paul John Knowles, or the Casanova Killer. This American serial killer was accused of murdering 18 people in 1974 in Florida, but proudly declares that he had in fact 35 victims in total. He eventually lost his life in a police car while trying to escape. Rodney Alcala was an American rapist and serial killer. He was sentenced to death for killing 5 people in California, although the actual number of his victims will remain unknown. He was known for extreme cruelty. His prosecutors stated that he killed to torture and play with his victims for a long time before finishing them off. Aside from committing a crime against his own person by mistaking his face for a drafting and drawing book, Nico Jenkins was also responsible for 4 murders in Omaha in 2013. This occurred just weeks after he was released from prison after 10.5 years for carjacking. His criminal record became dirty when he was only 7 years old, as he was accused of bringing a gun to school. If the US justice system had known this, they would have kept him warm in prison for longer. He was sentenced to death in 2017, but recently appealed that sentence. The nerve! No matter what you think, the September 11 attacks are not the deadliest in the United States. Long before, in 1995, a certain Timothy McVeigh was responsible for a bombing in Oklahoma City and consequently killed 168 people, including 19 children, and injured more than 1,680 others. He also destroyed 1/3 of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The Gulf War veteran says the act was a kind of revenge against the federal government for the 1993 siege of Waco that resulted in the deaths of 82 people, as well as the 1992 Ruby Ridge incident and US foreign policy. Well, it looks like his revenge was successful. Harold Shipman is one of the greatest serial killers of his century, having committed 200 murders, but was only convicted for 15 of them. That was the official figures. It seems that he had more than 400 victims in total, enough to make you cringe. The funny thing is that this British man was a general practitioner, so he was supposed to save lives, not waste them. Pedro Lopez is a dangerous Colombian serial killer who has a series of serious crimes on his record. He was only interested in young girls, and he took advantage of the high rate of corruption of the South American police at the time to commit his crimes. 110 girls were killed between the 70s and 80s, and another 300 victims in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador in the following years. Who can do better? We understand better why he is called the Monster of the Andes.